The baby wasn't breathing, and Nala knew it the moment her first cub slid into the world beneath the acacia tree where she had retreated from the pride to give birth in the protective solitude that lioness instinct demanded for this vulnerable moment. Understanding in the way that mothers across every species know when something has gone terribly wrong with a process that should result in new life, but has instead produced only stillness and silence. The tiny body lay motionless in the grass with its chest neither rising nor falling with the first desperate gasps that newborn mammals made when transitioning from womb to air, and there was no movement or sound or response when Nala nuzzled the cub with her nose trying to stimulate the breathing reflex that should have activated automatically, but remained dormant because there was no life to breathe. The pride knew immediately what had happened because they had seen it before in the harsh mathematical reality of savanna survival, where not every pregnancy ended in viable offspring, and where nature was efficient in eliminating genetic combinations that failed to produce functional living creatures. And the alpha female Sarabi approached to assess the situation, while making the low rumbling vocalization that communicated clear instruction about what needed to happen next. "Leave it," the vocalization meant. "The cub is gone, and we need to move because standing here serves no purpose when the baby is already dead, and the pride has living cubs who need protection and food, and the constant vigilance that keeps young lions alive through their vulnerable first months." But Nala didn't look at Sarabi or acknowledge the alpha's instruction with any response that suggested comprehension or compliance, instead carefully lifting the dead cub in her jaws and gripping it by the scruff of the neck in the same gentle but secure hold that lionesses use to transport living cubs who needed to be carried to new locations when dens were compromised or hunting territories shifted. She stood up with a small lifeless body dangling from her mouth and turned away from Sarabi, who vocalized again with more insistence about the necessity of abandoning the dead infant and moving forward with the pride's normal activities. But Nala simply walked away while carrying her baby because she was not accepting the reality that every other member of the pride understood without question. The cub wasn't dead in Nala's perception of the situation. Or perhaps more accurately, the cub was dead, but Nala's brain and body were not capable of processing that reality in ways that led to appropriate behavioral responses. Because her maternal hormones and instincts were screaming that she had a newborn who needed constant care and protection, and she was going to provide that care regardless of what the evidence suggested about the actual state of her offspring. For 17 days, Nala carried her dead cub in her jaws everywhere she went, maintaining constant grip on the tiny decomposing body while hunting and sleeping and traveling with the pride, who watched this unprecedented behavior with what rangers would later interpret as confusion and concern mixed with the patient tolerance that social animals sometimes extended to members who were behaving abnormally due to trauma or grief that fell outside normal behavioral repertoires. The cub decomposed over those 17 days while progressing through stages of biological breakdown that made it increasingly obvious to any observer that this was not a sleeping infant, but rather a corpse that should have been abandoned within hours of death, according to every documented pattern of lion maternal behavior that researchers had compiled through decades of field observations across multiple populations and ecological contexts. But Nala didn't abandon the cub despite the mounting evidence of death that included smell and visual deterioration and complete absence of any movement or response, instead carrying this burden through the hottest hours of afternoon sun when the savanna turned into a furnace and every predator sought shade to avoid heat exhaustion, through cold nights when her jaws must have ached from the constant pressure of maintaining grip on something that no longer needed transport because it was beyond all need, and through hunting attempts when the logical strategy would have been to leave the cub hidden somewhere safe the way lionesses did with living cubs who were too young to keep up with adult movement, except there was no safety to protect. Because the cub was already beyond harm. The cub decomposed over those 17 days while progressing through stages of biological breakdown that made it increasingly obvious to any observer that this was not a sleeping infant, but rather a corpse that should have been abandoned within hours of death, according to every documented pattern of lion maternal behavior that researchers had compiled through decades of field observations across multiple populations and ecological contexts. Before we continue this devastating journey through maternal grief that challenged everything scientists believed about how animals processed death and loss, if stories about the depth of a mother's love and the pain of being unable to let go touch something in your heart, we want to hear from you. Please tell us in the comments. How old are you, and where in the world are you watching this from? We love connecting with viewers across generations and continents, And knowing that these stories about the most profound emotions that mammals experience reach people everywhere regardless of language or culture, reminds us that grief and love are universal experiences that transcend species boundaries. Consider subscribing to Lion King Stories for more true tales that prove animals feel loss as deeply as humans do, that maternal bonds can override every survival instinct when death takes a child too soon, and that sometimes the hardest thing about love is learning when to let go even though every fiber of your being screams to hold on forever. The birth had occurred on a Tuesday morning in October 2019 in the Serengeti, and Ranger Maria Nkosi had been monitoring Nala's pregnancy for weeks leading up to the delivery, because first-time mothers often experience complications that researchers wanted to document for understanding lion reproduction and survival rates. Maria had positioned herself at a respectful distance when Nala retreated from the pride, showing signs that labor was beginning, and she had observed through binoculars as the birth progressed through its normal stages until the moment when it became clear that something had gone wrong. The cub had been malpositioned during delivery, emerging in a presentation that created difficulties and delays that might have contributed to fetal distress and death before the birth was complete. Or perhaps there had been congenital abnormalities incompatible with life that would have killed the cub within hours, even if it had somehow survived the birth process. Or maybe the cub had simply been one of the statistical casualties of reproduction, where random genetic or developmental problems created offspring that nature had not designed to survive, because survival of the species required eliminating variants that lacked the necessary attributes for functioning as successful lions. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a dead cub that should have been abandoned immediately according to every pattern that Maria had observed in 25 years of studying lion maternal behavior. Lionesses experiencing stillbirths or early cub deaths typically showed brief grief responses lasting hours or perhaps a day at most, during which they would remain near the body, occasionally nuzzling or attempting to stimulate the dead cub, before finally accepting reality and rejoining the pride to resume normal activities. The evolutionary logic was straightforward. Resources invested in dead offspring were resources unavailable for future reproduction, and females who quickly moved on from reproductive failures had better lifetime reproductive success than those who grieved extensively and delayed their return to breeding condition. But Nala didn't follow this pattern. 3 days after the birth, when Maria observed Nala still carrying the cub that was by that point visibly decomposing with signs of tissue breakdown and discoloration that made its death undeniable to any observer, Maria radioed to her research coordinator. "This is Maria at Sector 7. Nala is still carrying her stillborn cub. 72 hours post-birth. This is not normal behavior. I need additional observers to confirm, because this might be significant. Over." The confirmation came within hours as 3 other rangers converged on Maria's position and documented that Nala was indeed still transporting a dead cub that she should have abandoned days earlier. What unfolded over the following 2 weeks became one of the most extensively documented cases of maternal grief in wild lions, providing insights into animal consciousness and emotion that challenged comfortable assumptions about how different human psychology was from the inner lives of other social mammals. Day 4 brought the first serious threat to Nala's possession of the cub when a clan of spotted hyenas detected the scent of decomposition and attempted to steal what they correctly identified as carrion that represented easy calories requiring no dangerous hunting. Hyenas were both scavengers and predators who opportunistically took advantage of any food source they could acquire through theft or predation, and they had evolved sophisticated strategies for stealing kills from lions who were often distracted or outnumbered enough that defense was not worth the injury risk. But when 6 hyenas approached Nala, where she rested with a dead cub positioned between her paws in the protective posture that lionesses adopted with living cubs they were guarding, Nala's response was immediate and violent. She attacked without hesitation despite the numerical disadvantage that should have made retreat the logical choice, fighting with intensity that suggested she was defending something alive and precious rather than something dead and valueless. The battle was brutal and one-sided in ways that surprised the hyenas, who retreated after only 3 minutes with 2 of their number seriously injured, and the others recognizing that this lioness was prepared to die rather than surrender the carcass she was protecting. Rangers who witnessed this confrontation noted that Nala never dropped the cub during the fight, maintaining her grip on the tiny body even while lunging and swiping at hyenas with her paws, creating a fighting style that was mechanically awkward and tactically disadvantaged compared to the normal patterns of lion combat, where all four limbs and the jaws were used coordinately to maximize damage while minimizing exposure. The fact that Nala was willing to fight at such disadvantage suggested that dropping the cub was simply not an option her brain was capable of considering, as if the dead infant had become a permanent extension of her body that she could no more release than she could voluntarily stop breathing. By day 7, the decomposition had progressed to the point where the smell was noticeable from considerable distance, creating a problem for the pride who were trying to hunt prey that could detect the scent of death from hundreds of meters away and would avoid any area that suggested the presence of predators or danger. Sarabi approached Nala multiple times during days 7 through 10, attempting to communicate through vocalizations and body language that Nala needed to abandon the cub or leave the pride, because the dead baby was compromising the survival of the entire group by making hunting more difficult and by attracting scavengers and potentially other predators who might investigate the source of the smell. By the 7th day after the stillbirth, the other lionesses in the pride had begun to understand that what they were witnessing was not temporary grief that would resolve within the normal time frame that evolution had programmed into social carnivores, but rather something else entirely that fell outside their experience and created growing unease about the consequences for the group's survival and cohesion. The smell had become the first undeniable sign that this situation was abnormal in ways that demanded attention. Because the sweet, sickly, unmistakable scent of decomposition could be detected by rangers from 50 meters downwind and was even more obvious to the other lions, whose olfactory systems were far more sensitive to chemical signals that indicated death and danger and the presence of carrion that might attract scavengers or disease vectors. The 3 healthy 4-month-old cubs belonging to Sarabi would approach Nala cautiously when their natural curiosity about the strange object in her jaws overcame their normal wariness of adult females who were not their mothers. But they would retreat quickly when the scent registered in their developing brains and triggered the instinctive avoidance responses that evolution had built into young mammals to protect them from pathogens associated with decomposing flesh. Nala continued her normal routines during this period as if nothing was wrong with her situation, lying in shade during the hottest afternoon hours when movement was dangerous and energy-draining, drinking at the waterhole at dawn when predators and prey alike gathered at the few remaining water sources during the dry season, and following the pride when they moved to new territory in response to prey movements or territorial pressures from neighboring groups, all standard lioness behaviors. That suggested normal functioning except for the single overwhelming exception that the dead cub never left her mouth regardless of what activities she engaged in or what practical difficulties this constant burden created for normal life maintenance. The 8th day brought rain in the form of a brief but intense afternoon thunderstorm that transformed the Serengeti into a temporary wetland before the sun returned to bake everything dry again within hours of the downpour ending. And most lions responded to this weather event by seeking shelter under trees or in rocky outcroppings where they could wait out the precipitation in relative protection from the pounding water and the lightning that accompanied these violent atmospheric disturbances. Nala did not seek shelter, but instead stood in the open ground where rain hammered down with force sufficient to soak her coat within minutes and create rapidly expanding pools of water on the hard-packed earth that had been baked to concrete hardness by weeks of drought preceding this storm, and she maintained her position in this exposed location while keeping her head tilted upward at an awkward angle that served to elevate the dead cub above the pooling water on the ground as if drowning, remained a meaningful threat to something that had been dead for 8 days and was beyond all harm that water or any other environmental factor could inflict. Ranger Maria Nkosi observed this behavior from inside her Land Rover, where she had taken refuge from the storm, while continuing to document Nala's activities through binoculars and with video equipment that captured footage researchers would later analyze frame by frame in attempts to understand what psychological or neurological processes were generating behavioral patterns that had no precedent in the extensive scientific literature on lion maternal behavior and grief responses. The video showed Nala maintaining that head-elevated position for 40 continuous minutes, while rain streamed down her face, and her neck muscles visibly strained from the sustained effort required to keep the cub raised above water level, creating a scene that Maria described in her voice recorder as simultaneously heartbreaking and puzzling because the lioness was clearly trying to protect her baby from environmental hazards, despite the obvious reality that no protection served any purpose. when the baby had been dead since the moment of birth 8 days earlier. The 9th day marked the point when Sarabi reached the limit of her patience and tolerance for a situation that was creating increasingly serious problems for the pride's survival and functioning. Because the alpha female had been more accommodating than anyone expected, given that her primary responsibility was protecting the collective welfare of the group, rather than indulging individual members who were engaging in behaviors that compromised hunting success and territorial security. The pride had failed to make any successful kills in 4 consecutive days because prey animals were detecting the smell of decomposition from considerable distances and avoiding the entire territory that the lions occupied, creating a food shortage that was affecting the 3 healthy cubs who needed consistent nutrition during their critical growth period, when inadequate calories could result in permanent developmental deficits or outright mortality. Sarabi approached Nala during the midday heat, when every animal's energy was at its lowest and defensive capabilities were compromised by the physiological demands of thermoregulation in temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, positioning herself directly in Nala's path in a blocking posture that communicated unmistakable intention to force a confrontation about the situation that had been allowed to continue for 9 days, but could not continue indefinitely without consequences. The 2 lionesses stared at each other for 10 seconds that stretched into what felt like eternity for the rangers observing this interaction through telephoto lenses, and in that moment of locked gazes between sisters who had been born in the same litter 6 years earlier and had shared every significant experience of their lives, including cooperative hunts and territorial battles and births and deaths, and the constant challenges of surviving in an environment where every day brought new threats, there existed the entire history of their relationship and the impossible choice that was being forced by circumstances neither of them had created but both had to navigate. Sarabi vocalized first with a low rumbling sound that rangers familiar with lion communication interpreted as conveying the message that Nala needed to drop the dead cub or leave the pride because the current situation was unsustainable and was threatening the survival of cubs who actually had futures worth protecting. And this ultimatum represented not cruelty, but rather the hard mathematics of group living where individual desires had to be balanced against collective welfare in ways that sometimes required painful decisions about who stayed and who left. Day 10 through 16 became the loneliest period of Nala's life as rangers tracked her movements through GPS collar data and direct observation, documenting a lioness trying to survive alone in an environment where solo living was nearly impossible for females who depended on cooperative hunting and group defense. She lost weight rapidly because hunting alone while carrying a dead cub in your jaws was a challenge that evolution had never prepared lions to face, forcing her to choose between dropping the cub to make the killing lunge or maintaining grip and missing the opportunity, and she never dropped the cub, which meant she missed every opportunity. For 6 days, her primary food source was scavenging from carcasses that hyenas had already picked over, surviving on scraps and bones with minimal meat, whatever she could access without needing the explosive speed and full jaw capability that successful predation required. Rangers calculated she was consuming perhaps 30% of the calories she needed to maintain healthy body weight, and her ribs became visible, her coat lost its sheen, her movements grew slower and more cautious as weakness set in, but still the cub remained in her jaws. Day 12 brought the closest call. Nala had found a zebra carcass that hyenas had killed during the night and partially consumed. She approached cautiously, checked for threats, and began feeding on what remained, still keeping the dead cub gripped carefully while tearing meat with the side of her mouth in an awkward eating method that only allowed small bites. She didn't notice the 3 male lions approaching from downwind until they were less than 30 meters away. Male lions were a threat to lone females for 2 reasons. First, mating opportunities. Males would sometimes force copulation with solitary females, which was traumatic but survivable. Second, and more dangerous, territorial aggression. If these males viewed Nala as a trespasser in their territory, they might kill her simply to eliminate competition for resources. Nala looked up, saw them, and froze. The 3 males were young, maybe 3 years old enough to be dangerous, but not yet experienced enough to have established their own pride. They were in that transitional phase where aggression was high and judgment was poor, the most dangerous combination in male lions. The lead male approached, nostrils flaring. He could smell the death scent. Probably assumed Nala had a kill she was guarding. His body language showed clear intention to investigate and likely steal whatever food was generating that smell. He got within 5 meters before he saw what Nala was carrying. Not a kill. A cub. Dead. Decomposed. The male stopped. Confused. This didn't fit any pattern in his limited experience. Lionesses didn't carry dead cubs, especially not cubs that had clearly been dead for many days. What was happening here? The confusion saved Nala's life. Because the male didn't know how to respond to something he'd never encountered, he defaulted to caution. He vocalized a questioning sound and looked back at the other 2 males as if asking, "Do you understand this?" They didn't. After 30 seconds of uncertainty, the 3 males simply left, walking away from Nala and her zebra scraps and her dead baby that made no sense to their lion brains programmed for straightforward violence and reproduction and territorial control. Maria had watched this entire encounter from 400 meters away, heart pounding, certain she was about to witness Nala's death, and completely unable to intervene because human interference in natural processes was prohibited except in cases of human-caused harm. Day 12, she recorded after the males disappeared. 3 young males encountered Nala and the cub. They left without engaging. I think they were confused. They didn't understand what they were seeing, and confusion made them choose retreat over aggression. Another pause. The dead cub just saved Nala's life, because it was too strange, too outside normal lion behavior. The weirdness itself became protection. The confrontation on day 11 was the breaking point when Sarabi made clear that Nala had to choose: drop the cub or go into temporary exile until she was ready to rejoin the group without the dead baby. Nala looked at Sarabi, looked at the decomposing cub in her jaws, and made a choice that stunned the observers who had been documenting this situation. She turned and walked away from the pride, choosing voluntary exile over surrendering the dead infant she had been carrying for 11 days through heat and cold and hunger and threat. For the next 6 days, Nala survived alone, separated from the cooperative hunting and protection that pride membership provided, vulnerable to attack from hyenas or male lions who might view a solitary female as a mating opportunity or a territorial threat to eliminate. She lost visible body weight during this period, struggling to hunt effectively while maintaining constant grip on the cub and while weakened by the extended grief and stress that were taking physical toll on her condition. Rangers monitoring her movements worried that she might die, either from predation or from the cumulative effects of not eating enough and not resting properly because she refused to put down the dead baby even to sleep or to drink water at the few remaining sources available during the dry season. But on day 17, something changed. Maria was observing Nala from her usual monitoring position when she noticed that the lioness was moving differently, walking with purpose toward a specific location rather than the aimless wandering that had characterized much of the previous 2 weeks. Nala stopped beneath a cluster of acacia trees approximately 200 meters from where the pride was resting, and she gently lowered the dead cub to the ground for the first time in 17 days. Day 17. 5:47 a.m. Maria's field notes would later show the exact time because she had been checking her watch obsessively every few minutes, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Nala had woken earlier than usual, before dawn, before the rest of the pride stirred. She lay still for perhaps 20 minutes, the dead cub still gripped in her jaws as it had been for 408 hours straight. Then she stood, and she began walking. Not the aimless wandering of the previous days. This was purposeful, directed, as if she had made a decision during those 20 minutes of stillness, and now was acting on it before courage could fail. She walked 200 meters from where the pride rested. Far enough for privacy. Close enough that she wouldn't be completely alone in what was coming next. She stopped beneath acacia trees that provided dappled shade from the rising sun. And then, very slowly, very gently, she lowered her head and released her grip. For the first time in 17 days, the dead cub touched ground that wasn't her jaws. What happened next lasted 43 minutes. Maria timed it, recorded it, documented every detail because she understood she was witnessing something that might never be observed again, a lioness conducting what could only be described as a funeral. Nala didn't leave immediately. She sat down approximately 3 meters from where the cub lay in the grass, close enough to see it clearly, far enough that she wasn't touching it. She sat in Sphinx position, paws forward, head up, alert, watching, just watching. For 43 minutes. The cub was barely recognizable as having once been a lion. 17 days of decomposition in African heat had reduced it to something that looked more like darkened leather than flesh. But Nala watched it as if it might still move, still breathe, still give some sign that the vigil had been worth it. Nothing moved. Rangers studying the footage later would note that Nala's ears were forward during this entire period. Forward ears meant attention and engagement rather than the flattened back position that indicated fear or aggression. She was paying attention, focused, as if memorizing every detail of this moment before it ended. 30 minutes into the vigil, Nala vocalized. A soft sound, nothing like the roars that lions used for long-distance communication. This was quiet, intimate, the kind of sound a mother makes to a nursing cub. A comfort sound, a "you're safe" sound. Except the cub wasn't safe. The cub was dead. Had been dead since the moment it entered the world 17 days ago. But Nala made the sound anyway. Maybe muscle memory. Maybe hope. Maybe just the need to do something that felt like mothering when everything else about the situation denied her the opportunity to be the mother her body insisted she was supposed to be. At 40 minutes, something shifted. Nala stood, approached the cub, lowered her head. Maria held her breath, camera focused, uncertain what would happen next. Nala extended one front paw. Slowly, carefully, she touched the cub's head with her paw pad. Gentle, the way lionesses touch living cubs when checking them during rest periods. A wellness check. An "are you okay?" gesture. The touch lasted 5 seconds. The cub, of course, didn't respond. Nala withdrew her paw. She stood there for another 30 seconds, just looking, and then she turned around. Not gradually, not with hesitation. She simply turned her body 180 degrees so that she was facing away from the cub she had carried for 408 hours. She took 5 steps, stopped. Her body language showed conflict, tension in her shoulders, tail movements suggesting agitation. 5 more steps. Stopped again. This happened 3 times. Walk 5 steps. Stop. Internal battle visible in every muscle. After the 3rd stop, Nala didn't look back. That seemed to be her rule. She could stop. She could doubt. But she wouldn't look back because if she looked back, she would return. On the 4th set of steps, she didn't stop at 5. She kept walking. 10 steps. 20. 30. At 40 steps, rangers measured it later from the footage. Nala broke into a run. Not a full sprint, but faster than a walk. As if she was escaping, fleeing, getting away from something dangerous, or fleeing from herself. from the part that wanted to go back. That wanted 17 days to become 18 and 18 to become 20 and 20 to become forever, because letting go meant admitting the truth she'd been denying since the moment that cub had emerged stillborn. It was really dead. It had always been dead. And no amount of carrying would change that. Nala ran for approximately 100 meters before slowing to a walk. She didn't look back once during that run. Maria noted that detail specifically in her field notes. Subject did not turn head or slow pace until completely out of visual range of the remains. Behavior suggests deliberate avoidance of stimulus that might trigger return. By 6:30 a.m., Nala had rejoined the pride. Sarabi saw her approaching. Saw that Nala was alone. No dead cub in her jaws. No dead weight dragging down her movement. The alpha female approached. The two sisters made eye contact. No vocalization occurred. Sarabi simply moved aside, creating space for Nala to return to her position within the pride structure. Welcome back. We don't talk about the last 17 days. You went somewhere we couldn't follow. But you came back. That's what matters. At 9:15 a.m., 3 hours after Nala had released the cub, Maria hiked to the acacia trees to document the remains. She photographed them from multiple angles, took measurements, collected samples for later analysis if needed. The tiny body lay in grass that showed the depression where Nala had sat during her 43-minute vigil. The tooth marks on the scruff were clearly visible, shallow indentations that had never deepened despite 408 hours of constant carrying. Nala had maintained precise pressure control the entire time, never crushing, never damaging beyond what was necessary to maintain secure grip. Maria's final field note for that day. After 17 days, Nala finally put her baby down. Not because she wanted to. Because she had to. Because even grief this powerful can't last forever when survival demands we move forward. Because sometimes being a mother means knowing when holding on becomes holding back. And because maybe, after 17 days of refusing to accept death, she finally understood that her baby wasn't coming back. That no amount of carrying would wake it. That letting go was the only way to honor what she'd lost. Maria paused, then added one more line. I've studied lions for 25 years. I've never seen anything that looked more human than what I witnessed today. Grief is grief, whether you walk on 4 legs or 2. What followed was a ritual that looked like nothing so much as a funeral, though rangers were careful about using that term because it implied conscious understanding of death and deliberate ceremonial behavior that most scientists were reluctant to attribute to non-human animals. Nala sat approximately 3 meters from where the cub lay, and she remained in that position for nearly 40 minutes, simply watching the small body that was by this point barely recognizable as having once been a lion cub. So advanced was the decomposition that only the size and vague shape indicated what it had been. After 40 minutes of this vigil, Nala approached the cub and touched it gently with one paw, making contact with the head in a gesture that human observers interpreted as a final goodbye, even though attributing such specific meaning to animal behavior was methodologically questionable. Then Nala turned and walked away, slowly at first, but accelerating to a run after covering about 20 meters, as if she had to escape quickly before her resolve weakened and brought her back to reclaim the body she had finally managed to release. Rangers approached the site 3 hours later and documented the scene with photographs and measurements that provided physical evidence of what had occurred. The cub showed clear signs of having been carried gently for 17 days without significant crushing or damage beyond the normal decomposition that would have occurred with any dead tissue exposed to heat and insects. The tooth marks on the scruff of the neck were shallow and carefully placed, indicating that Nala had maintained constant awareness of how much pressure she was applying, treating the dead cub with the same gentle care that lionesses showed when transporting living cubs who could be injured by grips that were too tight or too careless. Dr. Seram Thembu analyzed the case months later and argued that Nala's behavior represented grief-induced denial, where the lioness was unable to emotionally accept a reality that her cognitive systems understood. Comparable to humans who know intellectually that a loved one has died but continue setting a place for them at dinner, because emotional adaptation to loss proceeds on a different timeline than cognitive recognition of death. The 17-day duration likely represented the time required for Nala's hormonal state to return to baseline after the failed pregnancy, and for her brain chemistry to shift away from the heightened maternal responsiveness that characterized the immediate postpartum period. And once those hormonal changes were complete, her ability to recognize and accept the reality of the cub's death improved enough that she could finally release the body and begin recovering from the grief that had consumed her for more than 2 weeks. 3 weeks after abandoning the cub, Nala had rejoined the pride and was showing behavior patterns that rangers classified as within normal range for adult lionesses, including participation in cooperative hunts and appropriate social relationships with pride members, and no signs of continued mourning or searching behavior that might indicate unresolved grief, suggesting that the experience had been survived and processed in ways that allowed her to resume normal functioning. Rangers who had witnessed those 17 days carried knowledge that would not resolve so easily, because they had watched a mother refuse to surrender her dead baby for more than 2 weeks despite every pressure from nature and society to let go. And this refusal represented grief so profound that it overrode survival instincts and social bonds that should have been more powerful than attachment to something that no longer existed as a living being. If this story moved you and made you think about the nature of maternal love and the pain of loss that crosses species boundaries, we would be honored if you would share your experiences with our community by telling us in the comments how old you are and where in the world you are watching from. And if you feel comfortable sharing whether you have ever experienced a loss where you found it impossible to let go even when everyone around you said it was time to move on, because your stories matter and remind us that grief is not weakness, but rather the price we pay for love, and that the depth of our mourning reflects the depth of our attachment to those we have lost. Nala's 17 days of carrying her dead cub might seem like irrational denial to scientific analysis. But to anyone who has ever experienced grief that felt like it would never end, those 17 days represent something we all understand about how sometimes love means refusing to let go even when letting go is the only rational choice, and sometimes healing requires holding on before you can finally find the strength to walk away. Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more true tales that prove animals feel the same grief we do, and that maternal bonds transcend the boundaries of life and death when love is strong enough. And thank you for being part of our pride, and for bringing your open hearts to these difficult stories that honor the depths of emotion that all mothers experience regardless of species.